Kerry Balder reads The Scottish Fairy Book by Elizabeth Grierson. Preface. There are, roughly speaking, two distinct types of Scottish fairy tales. There are what may be called Celtic stories, which were handed down for centuries by word of mouth by professional storytellers, who went about from Cleghan to Cleghan in the Highlands and Islands, earning a night's shelter by giving a night's entertainment, and which have now been collected and classified for us by Campbell of Isla and others. These stories, which are also common to the north of Ireland, are wild and fantastic, and very often somewhat monotonous, and their themes are strangely alike. They almost always tell of some hero or heroine who sets out on some dangerous quest, and who is met by giants, generally 3 in number, who appear one after the other, with whom they hold quaint dialogues, and whom eventually they slay. Most of them are fairly long, and although they have a peculiar fascination of their own, they are quite distinct from the ordinary fairy tale. These latter, in Scotland, have also a character of their own, for there is no country where the existence of spirits and goblins has been so implicitly believed in up to a comparatively recent date. As a proof of this, we can go to Hog's Tales of the Wool Gatherer and see how the countryman Barnaby voices the belief of his day. Ye had need to take care how ye dispute the existence of fairies, brownies, and apparitions. Ye may as well dispute the Gospel of Saint Matthew. Perhaps it was the bleak and stern character of their climate, and the austerity of their religious beliefs, which made our Scottish forefathers think of the spirits in whom they so firmly believed, as being, for the most part, mischievous and malevolent. Their bogies, their witches, their kelpies, even their fairy queen herself, were supposed to be in league with the evil one, and to be compelled, as Thomas of Ercildoune was near finding out to his cost, to pay a tient to hell every 7 years. So it was not to be wondered at that these uncanny beings were dreaded and feared. But along with this dark and gloomy view, we find touches of delicate playfulness and brightness. The fairy queen might be in league with Satan, but her subjects were not all bound by the same law, and many charming tales are told of the Sith, or silent folk, who were always spoken of with respect, in case they might be within earshot, and made their dwellings under some rocky knoll, and who came out and danced on the dewy sward at midnight. Akin to them are the tales which are told about a mysterious region under the sea, far below the abode of fishes, where a strange race of beings lived, who, in their own land, closely resembled human beings, and were of such surpassing beauty that they charmed the hearts of all who looked on them. They were spoken of as mermaids and mermen, and as their lungs were not adapted for breathing underwater, they had the extraordinary power of entering into the skin of some fish or sea animal, and in this way passing from their own abode to our upper world, where they held converse with mortal men, and as often as not tried to lure them to destruction. The popular idea always represents merfolk as wearing the tails of fishes. In Scottish folklore, they are quite as often found in the forms of seals. Then we frequently come across the brownie, that strange, kindly, laughable creature, with its shaggy, unkempt appearance, half man, half beast, who was said to be the ordained helper of man in the drudgery entailed by sin, and was therefore forbidden to receive wages, who always worked when no one was looking, and who disappeared if any notice were taken of him. There are also, as in all other countries, animal tales, where the animals are endowed with the power of speech, and weird tales of enchantment. And last, but not least, there are the legendary stories, many of them half real, half mythical, which are to be found in the pages of Hock and Leyden, and above all, in Sir Walter Scott's Border Minstrelsy. In preparing this book, I have tried to make a representative collection from these different classes of Scottish folklore, taking, when possible, the stories which are least well known, in the hope that some of them, at least, may be new to the children of this generation. It may interest some of these children to know that when James IV was a little boy, nearly 400 years ago, he used to sit on his tutor, Sir David Lindsay's knee, and listen to some of the same stories that are written here. To the story of Thomas the Rhymer, of the Red Ettin, and of the Black Bull of Norroway. Although, in every case, I have told the tale in my own words, I am indebted for the originals to Campbell's Popular Tales of the Western Highlands, Leyden's poems, Hock's poems, Scott's Border Minstrelsy, Chambers' Popular Rhymes of Scotland, the Folklore Journal, etc. Elizabeth W. Grierson, 12th of April 1910. Kerry Balder reads from the Scottish Fairy book by Elizabeth W. Grierson, the story The Fairies of Merlin's Crag. About 200 years ago, there was a poor man working as a labourer on a farm in Lanarkshire. He was what is known as an Oram man, that is, he had no special work mapped out for him to do, but he was expected to undertake odd jobs of any kind that happened to turn up. One day his master sent him out to cast peats on a piece of moorland that lay on a certain part of the farm. Now this strip of moorland ran up at one end to a curiously shaped crag, known as Merlin's Crag, because, so the country folk said, that famous enchanter had once taken up his abode there. The man obeyed, and, being a willing fellow, when he arrived at the moor, he set to work with all his might and main. He had lifted quite a quantity of peat from near the crag, when he was startled by the appearance of the very smallest woman that he had ever seen in his life. She was only about 2 feet high, and she was dressed in a green gown and red stockings, and her long yellow hair was not bound by any ribbon, but hung loosely around her shoulders. She was such a dainty little creature that the astonished countryman stopped working, stuck his spade into the ground, and gazed at her in wonder. His wonder increased when she held up one of her tiny fingers and addressed him in these words: "What wouldst thou think if I were to send my husband to uncover thy house? You mortals think that you can do aught that pleases you." Then, stamping her tiny foot, she added in a voice of command, "Put back the turf instantly, or thou shalt rue this day." Now the poor man had often heard of the fairy folk and of the harm they could work to unthinking mortals, so in fear and trembling he set to work to undo all his labor, and to place every divot in the exact spot from which he had taken it. When he was finished, he looked round for his strange visitor, but she had vanished completely. He could not tell how, nor where. Putting up his spade, he wended his way homewards, and going straight to his master, he told him the whole story, and suggested that in future the peats should be taken from the other end of the moor. But the master only laughed. He was a strong, hearty man, and had no belief in ghosts or elves or fairies or any other creature that he could not see. But although he laughed, he was vexed that his servant should believe in such things. So to cure him, as he thought, of his superstition, he ordered him to take a horse and cart and go back at once, and lift all the peats and bring them to dry in the farmsteading. The poor man obeyed with much reluctance, and was greatly relieved as weeks went on to find that, in spite of his having done so, no harm befell him. In fact, he began to think that his master was right, and that the whole thing must have been a dream. So matters went smoothly on. Winter passed, and spring and summer, until autumn came round once more, and the very day arrived on which the peats had been lifted the year before. That day, as the sun went down, the Aura man left the farm to go home to his cottage, and as his master was pleased with him because he had been working very hard lately, he had given him a little can of milk as a present to carry home to his wife. So he was feeling very happy, and as he walked along he was humming a tune to himself. His road took him by the foot of Merlin's Crag, and as he approached it, he was astonished to find himself growing strangely tired. His eyelids dropped over his eyes as if he were going to sleep, and his feet grew as heavy as lead. "I will sit down and take a rest for a few minutes," he said to himself. "The road home never seemed so long as it does today." So he sat down on a tuft of grass right under the shadow of the crag, and before he knew where he was, he had fallen into a deep and heavy slumber. When he awoke, it was near midnight, and the moon had risen on the crag, and he rubbed his eyes, when by its soft light he became aware of a large band of fairies who were dancing around and round him, singing and laughing, pointing their tiny fingers at him and shaking their wee fists in his face. The bewildered man rose and tried to walk away from them, but turn in whichever direction he would, the fairies accompanied him. encircling him in a magic ring, out of which he could in no wise go. At last they stopped, and, with shrieks of elfin laughter, led the prettiest and daintiest of their companions up to him, and cried, tread a measure, O man! Then wilt thou not be so eager to escape from our company? Now the poor labourer was but a clumsy dancer, and he held back with a shamefaced air. But the fairy, who had been chosen to be his partner, reached up and seized his hands, and lo, some strange magic seemed to enter into his veins. For a moment he found himself waltzing and whirling, sliding and bowing, as if he had done nothing else but dance all his life. And, strangest thing of all, he forgot about his home and his children, and he felt so happy that he had no longer the slightest desire to leave the fairies' company. All night long the merriment went on. The little folk danced and danced as if they were mad, and the farm man danced with them, until at last a shrill sound came over the moor. It was the cock from the farmyard crowing its loudest to welcome the dawn. In an instant the revelry ceased, and the fairies, with cries of alarm, crowded together and rushed towards the crag, dragging the countryman along in their midst. As they reached the rock, a mysterious door, which he never remembered having seen before, opened in it of its own accord and shut again with a crash as soon as the fairy host had all trooped through. The door led into a large, dimly lighted hall full of tiny couches, and here the little folk sank to rest, tired out with their exertions, while the good man sat down on a piece of rock in the corner, wondering what would happen next. But there seemed to be some kind of spell thrown over his senses, for even when the fairies awoke and began to go about their household occupations and to carry out certain curious practices which he had never seen before, and which, as you will hear, he was forbidden to speak of afterwards, he was content to sit and watch them. without in any way attempting to escape. As it drew toward evening, someone touched his elbow, and he turned round with a start to see the little woman with the green dress and scarlet stockings who had remonstrated with him for lifting the turf the year before, standing by his side. "The divots which thou tookst from the roof of my house have grown once more," she said, "and once more it is covered with grass, so thou canst go home again, for justice is satisfied. Thy punishment has lasted long enough. But first must thou take thy solemn oath never to tell to mortal ears what thou hast seen, whilst thou hast dwelt among us." The countryman promised gladly, and he took the oath with all due solemnity. Then the door was opened, and he was at liberty to depart. His can of milk was standing on the green, just where he had laid it down when he went to sleep, and it seemed to him as if it were only yesternight that the farmer had given it to him. But when he reached his home, he was speedily undeceived, for his wife looked at him as if he were a ghost, and the children whom he had left wee, toddling things, were now well-grown boys and girls, who stared at him as if he had been an utter stranger. "Where hast thou been these long, long years?" cried his wife, when she had gathered her wits and seen that it really was he and not a spirit. "And how couldst thou find it in thy heart to leave the bairns and me alone?" And then he knew that the one day he had passed in Fairyland had lasted 7 whole years, and he realized how heavy the punishment had been which the wee folk had laid upon him. End of story.